Hi, welcome to SED 7335, Literature for Adolescents. We're going to talk briefly about science fiction and fantasy. So let's start off with fantasy. What's important to know about fantasy, as well as science fiction, is that more than any other genre, it almost requires developing a love of it. It's a little bit like an acquired taste. Young readers aren't naturally drawn to fantasy or science fiction, but the best way to help your students develop a taste for this genre is to begin reading some aloud. When you start to read it aloud, does a great job of helping pique kids' interest in it. Part of the reason that this is true is because fantasy and science fiction a lot of times have some more difficult vocabulary and some more difficult concepts. And so by reading it aloud, you're keying into the fact that students' listening comprehension levels are about 3 to 4 grade levels higher than their reading comprehension levels. And so when you read it aloud, you're able to read aloud more complex or difficult text for them. So when we think about fantasy, there are several things that we're looking for in terms of what makes a good piece of fantasy for kids. One is that it should be characterized by a universal truth. So when the child or teen has finished reading this work of fantasy, there should be a truth that they can infer for living in today's world. It should also be characterized by consistency of the story. So a lot of times when authors write fantasy, they're world building, and sometimes they are creating rules for living in this fantasy world. Well, they have to follow their own rules when they write this fantasy. That's what I mean by consistency of the story. In addition, the plot needs to be original and ingenious. What we know from fantasy that's been written is sequels many times don't have the same staying power as the original, and the same is true of copycats. That's why we need some originality and some ingenuity. And finally, it needs to begin in reality, move to fantasy, and then end in reality. So take Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, for example. That's a great example of a work of fantasy that begins in reality on Privet Drive, moves to fantasy to Hogwarts, and then ends back in reality when Harry Potter returns to Privet Drive. In addition, the plot should be believable and plausible. If the readers think it's not plausible, they're going to close the book and stop reading. And there's several ways that authors can do this. They can make it believable by grounding it in reality. So if you think about the fantasy novel Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, the reality in which it's grounded is Zuckerman's Farm. Very believable place. Another thing that authors can do is pay close attention to detail. Wonderful example of that is a book called The Borrowers, about a small, tiny family that lives inside of a grandfather clock. And the author pays very close attention to detail in this story. So everything that shows up, that would show up in the larger world, also shows up inside the grandfather clock in miniature. The author can use believable and round characters. That's exactly what J.K. Rowling does in the Harry Potter series. And a final example of what authors can do to make the plot believable is by using false documentation. So there's a great book called The Pushcart War about a street war between pushcart vendors in New York City. And the author opens the book with false documentation. So there is a facsimile of a newspaper article from the New York City newspaper about the pushcart war, so it makes the story believable. If we think about fantasy versus science fiction, there's a fine line between the two genres. That fine line is that science fiction should be based on a scientific fact or theory. So when you think about that, that really points out that fantasy writers have more freedom than do writers of science fiction. If you're writing science fiction, you really have to make sure that there is a scientific fact or theory upon which the story is based. So thinking about both genres, What we know is that gifted children read significantly more fantasy and science fiction than average kids. And we also know that authors tend to write fantasy and science fiction for those intellectually curious kids or those gifted kids. That's where we see some of the more technical vocabulary or the more difficult vocabulary and the concepts that are harder to grasp. So, just like with fantasy, the best way to get students to fall in love with a piece of science fiction is by introducing it via a read aloud. Remember, that's because our listening comprehension level is 3 to 4 grade levels above our reading comprehension level. So some great examples out there of fantasy. These are a mixture of older and more contemporary pieces of fantasy. Elsewhere by Gabrielle Zevin. Beautifully written piece of fantasy about what happens when we die. Alexander Lloyd's series, The Chronicles of Prydian. It's got The High King, The Black Cauldron. It's a series of 5 books. Great examples of fantasy. Aragon by Christopher Paolini. That's a more contemporary example. The books that Tamara Pierce writes. Great examples of fantasy. The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. Another great piece of fantasy. In terms of science fiction, some good examples are A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle and that whole series. The People of Sparks, which is part of the City of Ember series by Jean Duprow. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Other things that fall here are books by Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, lots of others in fantasy too. So let's talk for just a minute about utopias and dystopias. These are really neither science fiction nor fantasy, but they share characteristics with both. They kind of fall into both categories. They're typically set in the future, with technology having played a role in establishing the conditions out of which the story grows. So technology usually plays some kind of role in the story. Once that situation is established, the authors focus less on technology and more on the sociological and psychological or possibly emotional aspects of the story. Some great examples are The Giver by Lois Lowry, the Gone series by Michael Grant, The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, The Way We Fall and that series by Megan Crew. And these utopias and dystopias are incredibly popular right now with kids. So that's it for science fiction and fantasy, but let's talk about some dates that are coming up. So November 15th, that you have a blog post due for BOMB, the race to build and steal the world's most dangerous weapon. Your blog post for Salt to the Sea is due on November 22nd, and also on November 22nd, you need to post a link to the voice thread that you create for your third choice book. So on the discussion board, you'll see you need to post a link to that voice thread, and then instead of everybody going to read your blog, they're going to go and view your voice thread. November 29th, you have blog posts due for both Every Day and for your final choice book. Also by November 29th, you need to have viewed and commented on your classmates' voice threads. And then on November 29th, that is also when your social networking assignment is due. I will keep you posted about our next our synchronous meeting online. Until then, I will see you online. I am leaving on Wednesday to attend the National Council of Teachers of English Convention in Atlanta, Georgia, as well as the Allen Workshop on Monday and Tuesday. So I'll be out of pocket for a bit, but still easily accessible via email. Thanks for tuning in. Y'all have a good week.